Okay, short history lesson. Let's go back in time to 1971. Then US President Richard Nixon, standing in front of the entire American populace, declared war on cancer. Billions of dollars, decades of research, the best scientific minds on the planet all pointed at a singular problem. It was an ambitious effort, obviously predicated on this idea that basically cancer could be cured with enough funding and focused research. And today, for the first time in US history, we are expected to cross 2 million new cancer diagnoses in a single year, which equates to around 5,700 people being diagnosed every single day. That doesn't sound like a war we're actually winning. How is it possible that after billions of dollars spent, so much time, 50 years, we have so little to show in terms of actual disease-free progression? This brings me to one of my favorite Wayne Dyer quotes, which is basically change the way you look at things and the things you look at change. And maybe it's how we're actually viewing the disease. Let's go back in time again, this time to me as an undergraduate student at Western University in London. And I can recall at that time all of the discussions we would have anytime our genetics professor or TAs would bring up the Human Genome Project, which essentially was a global initiative and with the ambitious goal of mapping the entire human genome. Now, this was the early 1990s, and at that time was funded by Big Pharma even at that time, but the medical science community hoped that by mapping the entire human genome, we could unlock the mystery behind most diseases, most notably cancer. Let's fast forward now to 1999. Recently married, and as 1999 was turning to 2000, the Y2K or year 2000 phenomenon took hold in the world. Now, as the new millennium approached, there was widespread concern about this so-called, quote, Y2K bug. The fear stemmed basically from the possibility that computers, which were programmed to recognize only the last 2 digits of a year, would interpret the year 2000 as 1900, which potentially could cause malfunctions in critical systems. So people worried about everything from banking and air traffic control to power grids and communication networks, everything. Like, if you could go back in time, the Y2K phenomenon was like insane, and governments and businesses spent billions prepping for this perceived threat, which led to a frenzy of Y2K readiness efforts. It's funny because thinking back, this was maybe the first time in history that both governments and conspiracy theorists were singing from the same songbook. That alone, for me, historically was noteworthy. My wife, so as it was coming closer, my wife and I, along with my brother and his wife, and in concert with 2 of our friends, decided to ring in the new year in a remote cabin in Tennessee's Smoky Mountains. And by the way, they both were IT professionals. And guess what happened when the clock struck midnight on January 1, 2000? Nothing. Absolutely nothing happened. The Human Genome Project, let's go forward 3 years, completed on April 14th, 2003, much like Y2K, has been anticlimactic. Uncovering the entire human genome did not unlock genes as the cause of disease. And in practice, we are still effectively treating cancer the exact same way as we were before we unlocked the entire human genome. So let's take, for example, a common chemotherapy, paclitaxel or Taxol. Still a cornerstone therapy, for most cancers or many cancers. And interestingly, paclitaxel was discovered in the 1960s after the National Cancer Institute initiated a project to screen natural products for potential anti-cancer properties. Essentially, they gave a bunch of money to a bunch of hippies to go through the jungle and try to find new drugs. They found the Pacific yew tree, which showed promising activity against cancer cells and was ultimately synthesized into one of cancer's most effective chemotherapy. It's too bad, actually, that the National Cancer Institute isn't still funding research to explore plant medicines. But again, that's a story for a different day. But why aren't we making the commensurate progress that we would expect 50 years later, all of this research later? Well, in 20 plus years since mapping our entire human genome, instead of learning that genes are far more responsive and variable to our environment and less fixed or predetermined, interestingly, we've seemed to double down on this idea of genes as still the cause of cancer. And our medical students are still being taught the same somatic mutation theory as the primary cause of cancer that we were taught. Now, this theory basically establishes or posits that accumulated genetic mutations are at the heart of the disease. And in my estimation, this dogged adherence to this theory is really a big part of the problem. And ironically, the researcher most credited with this theory, Theodore Boveri, never actually studied cancer. So while mutations are generally perceived as the initiating event, there's very little clinical data that actually supports this hypothesis. Now, genetic variations are present and they do occur, but they usually occur downstream, meaning after the onset of the disease proper. In other words, the genes are being expressed differently based on the epigenetic changes or stresses on those genes. So think about that. In plain terms, it's not the same. So while genetic changes do occur, they often occur much later in the process. In fact, the somatic mutation theory is valid for only about 5% of hereditary cancers. For the other 95%, we need better answers. And that's exactly where this journey begins, because there are better answers. Now, science has been there for over 100 years, largely ignored, underfunded for sure, and inconvenient to an industry that's really been built around a different theory. But data and science doesn't really care about the industry. Cancer cells behave metabolically in a way that is consistent, predictable, and most importantly, targetable. That's what this series is about. Not politics, not blame, just looking at things differently, a different lens. Because Dr. Wayne Dyer had it right. If you change the way you look at things, the things you look at change.